Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains. My heart will go on, and today we are going to discuss the Titanic? What? Wait, I'm sorry. Does anyone not know this story? Maybe. I'm not really sure. But what I am sure of is that this is the most famous disaster at sea in history by a considerable margin. But to continue our series of worst captains, we are going to discuss Edward Smith. Captain Edward Smith, who was the captain of the Titanic on her maiden voyage, which also proved to be her last voyage. Now, the details about Smith are a lot more complicated than I'd like, so I'm going to try to dumb everything down for you as best I can, because given the popularity of the Titanic and how many people know the story, or think they do, there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of things that are said that just aren't true, and in more recent times, people have become a lot more critical of the captain. This is the story of the RMS Titanic disaster. Now, once again, I am just kind of convinced that all of you, literally all of you, are at least a little bit familiar with the Titanic. So it feels silly of me to actually give you a deep dive into what exactly happened when it comes to this particular disaster, but I will give you an abridged version just to refresh your minds and to set the scene. RMS Titanic was a British passenger liner that was operated by the White Star Line. She was one of 3 Olympic-class ships, and she was the largest ship afloat at the time she entered service. Her sisters were Olympic and Britannic. These ships were, of course, ocean liners, but they were arguably the most glamorous and, dare I say, romantic ships on the ocean. The type of experience that first-class passengers would have on board these ships just couldn't be rivaled. I'd argue it even puts modern cruise ships to shame, and I imagine the pictures alone don't do her justice. Titanic was a beautiful vessel. She was laid down on the 31st of March, 1903, launched 31st of May, 1911, and finally completed on the 2nd of April, 1912. She started her first and last voyage on the 10th of April that same year. The voyage went on without incident. However, at 11:40 p.m. on the 14th of April, the lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg that was immediately ahead of Titanic and swiftly alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch then ordered the ship to be steered around this obstacle, as well as for the engines to be reversed to attempt to slow their speed. But by the time the lookout spotted the iceberg, it was too late for any of this. The starboard side of the Titanic was struck, and that created a series of holes that were below the waterline. The hull itself was not punctured by the iceberg, but actually dented, such that the hull seams buckled and separated, which allowed the water to rush in. 5 of the ship's watertight compartments, which were considered state-of-the-art, were breached, and that was a major problem because the Titanic was designed to be able to not sink if 4 of her compartments were flooded, but not 5. She began to sink bow first. One of the major problems that gets brought up is that the Titanic did not have enough lifeboats on board for all of her passengers. But that was not an issue with just her, that was in accordance with standard practice at that time. It was believed that since ships were so frequent across the Atlantic back then, that no ship would sink fast enough that another vessel couldn't show up to rescue the passengers. Thus, lifeboats were seen as a way to ferry passengers to another ship, and not actually have enough room for all those on board a vessel all at once. But as the Titanic proved, this idea was bad. Very bad. The crew also hadn't been trained adequately in carrying out an evacuation, so a lot of the officers didn't actually know how many people they could safely put aboard the lifeboats, so a lot of them wound up half full. The women and children first protocol was largely followed, and as a result most of the male passengers and the crew were left on board. Between 2:10 and 2:15 a.m., a little over 2.5 hours after hitting the iceberg, her rate of sinking increased. Her stern rose high out of the water, and she eventually snapped in two. The ocean waters were extremely cold, with temperatures of -2 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't until 4 a.m. that RMS Carpathia arrived in response to Titanic's distress calls. In total, 706 people managed to survive the disaster, but 1,517 died, and among the dead was the captain, Edward Smith. Now, as I said, the influence of Titanic overall from a cultural perspective can't be questioned, and there's a lot of information and misinformation about this disaster. It would take a video that was hours long for me to go over everything, so I'm going to try to make this as brief as I can when it comes to discussing the role of the captain during that time. But as I said, a lot of modern historians have started actually questioning how good of a captain he really was, and if there was anything he could have done to mitigate the disaster. But I want to stress at this point that, in my personal opinion, I don't see Captain Edward Smith as a bad ship captain necessarily. I think there are things he could have done differently, but we have the benefit of retrospect, and he was dealing with an extreme situation. But before we get to that, let's discuss his own history. Edward John Smith was born on the 27th of January 1850 on Wells Street, Hanley, Staffordshire, in England, to Edward Smith, who was a potter, and Catherine Hancock. He attended a Truro British school until the age of 13 when he left to operate a steam hammer at the Etruria Forge. In 1867, at the age of 17, he went to Liverpool in the footsteps of his half-brother, Joseph Hancock, who was a captain on a sailing ship. On the 13th of January 1887, Smith married Sarah Eleanor Pennington, and their daughter, Helen Melville Smith, was born in Waterloo, Liverpool on the 2nd of April, 1898. Smith joined the White Star Line in March 1880 as the 4th officer of SS Celtic. He served aboard their liners to Australia and to New York City, where he quickly began to rise in his own status. In 1887, he received his first White Star command, the Republic. Though, interestingly, he actually failed his first navigation exam, but on the next attempt the following week, he passed. And in February 1888, Smith earned his Extra Master's Certificate. He joined the Royal Naval Reserve, receiving a commission as a lieutenant, which entitled him to add the letters R and R after his name. That meant that in a time of war, he could be called upon to serve in the Royal Navy. His ships had the distinction of being able to fly the blue ensign of the R&R. British merchant vessels usually flew the red ensign. He retired from the R&R in 1905 with the rank of commander. Commencing in 1895, he was the captain of the RMS Majestic, and during that time he was regarded as a safe captain. He rose in seniority and notoriety. He actually gained a following amongst passengers, with some sailing the Atlantic only on a ship that he was the captain of. He then became known as the Millionaire's Captain. From 1904 on, Smith commanded the White Star Line's newest ships on their maiden voyages. In 1904, he was given command of what was then the largest ship in the world, the Baltic. Her maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York on the 29th of June 1904 was without incident. After 3 years with her, Smith was given his second new big ship, the Adriatic. Once again, that voyage was totally normal. Everything went fine. And while he was in command of Adriatic, he received the long-distance decoration for officers of the Royal Navy Reserve. By this point, he was one of the world's most experienced sea captains, and he was called upon to take command of the lead ship in a new class of ocean liners, the Olympic, Titanic's sister. Once again, she would have been the largest vessel in the world at that time. The maiden voyage from Southampton to New York was successfully concluded on the 21st of June, 1911, but this wasn't without incident. As Olympic was docking in New York Harbor, a small incident did happen. Docking at Pier 59 under the command of Captain Smith with the assistance of a harbor pilot, Olympic was actually being assisted by 12 tugs when one of them got caught in the backwash of the ship. The much smaller boat spun around and collided with the Olympic, For a moment, she was trapped under Olympic's stern, though the tug managed to work herself free and return to the docks. Based on the description, it doesn't seem like it was anything that Captain Smith necessarily did wrong, but there was an incident that did happen on the 20th of September 1911, again with Olympic. This was a much more major incident that resulted in Olympic colliding with a British warship, HMS Hawke. This caused the warship to lose her prow, and it left Olympic with 2 of her compartments filled and one of her propeller shafts twisted, but she was able to get back to Southampton. At the inquiry, the Royal Navy blamed Olympic, finding that her massive size generated a suction that pulled Hawke into her side. Captain Smith had been on the bridge during the events, and the whole thing was kind of a financial disaster for the White Star Line. They had to pay the Royal Navy a whole bunch of money, and they had to pay to fix the Olympic, which was not cheap. It was also their biggest ship at the time, and they kind of needed her, and she'd be out of service for a few months. In fact, Titanic's completion was delayed by Harland and Wolff, because they decided to use one of her propeller shafts and other parts to fix Olympic. Olympic was back at sea by February 1912, but she lost a propeller blade again and returned for emergency repairs. Harland and Wolff again pulled resources from Titanic, which delayed her maiden voyage from the 20th of March to the 10th of April. But a lot of people point to the Hawke incident as being primarily Captain Smith's fault, though him passing too close to the Hawke was his mistake, but it wasn't a crippling one, and it didn't do much to stain his overall reputation with passengers. People still respected him, and he still had a tremendous amount of experience. The White Star Line, despite their financial frustrations, did still see him as their star guy. They again appointed him to command the newest ship in the Olympic class, the Titanic. Some sources state that he was planning to retire after Titanic's maiden voyage, but based off of actual sources, like really verified sources from back in the day, this may be entirely fabricated. And to be honest, it sounds like it's playing into the "but he had just one more day before retirement" trope that gets thrown around all the time. So believe what you want on that. On the 10th of April 1912, Captain Smith came aboard the Titanic at 7 a.m. to prepare for the Board of Trade muster at 8 a.m. He went to his cabin to get the sailing report from Chief Officer Henry Wilde. After departing at noon, the huge amount of water that was displaced by Titanic as she passed caused the laid-up New York to break from her moorings and swing towards Titanic. Smith quickly acted to avert a premature end to the maiden voyage and succeeded in avoiding the problem, although, in retrospect, maybe he should have just let the New York hit them. It might have been better overall. Now, jumping to the night of the disaster, it's worth mentioning the crew was aware that there was ice in the area they were in. The area was actually known to have icebergs frequently, but they didn't reduce the ship's speed and continued to speed at 22 knots, 41 kilometers per hour or 25 miles per hour. This is one element of Smith's decision-making that is commonly criticized, but the truth is that this was standard for the time. Ships often didn't slow in areas that might have icebergs. They just kept on going, because that's what they did. Smith wasn't doing anything that was unusual based off of the practices of the times. The fifth officer, Harold Lowe, explained that common procedure was to go ahead and depend on the lookouts in the crow's nest, as well as the watch on the bridge to pick up the ice in time to avoid hitting it. That idea was bad, but it was normal procedure. And this was because the North Atlantic liners prioritized timekeeping above all other considerations. They had a very rigid schedule that would guarantee arrival at an advertised time, and thus they were frequently driven at very, very close to their full speed, treating hazard warnings as advisories rather than actual, rules to follow. Really, they're more like guidelines. It was also commonly believed that ice did not pose that much of a risk to a ship of this size. A lot of close calls happened, and even head-on collisions on occasion, but nothing that had ever been really disastrous. In fact, Captain Smith, in an interview the same year as the voyage, said that he could not imagine any condition which would cause the ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Oh no, that was the wrong thing to say. Now, as I mentioned when I discussed the specifics of the disaster, Smith wasn't on duty when Titanic struck the iceberg. First Officer William Murdoch was. And one of the first things Murdoch did was inform the captain that they had collided with an iceberg. One of the first things Smith did was consult the designer of the Olympic class, Thomas Andrews, who was on board Titanic. And once they figured out exactly how much water was coming in and where, Andrews explained that all the first 5 of the ship's watertight compartments had been breached, and he thought the Titanic would sink in under 2 hours. She did last a little bit longer than that, but the point was, the ship was doomed. Andrews knew it, and that's what he told Captain Smith. So Smith knew it too. They also knew that common practice at the time was that there weren't enough lifeboats for everybody, and there are a lot of conflicting reports regarding exactly what Captain Smith did during the evacuation. Some say he did everything he could to prevent panic, and did his best to assist in the evacuation. Some survivors said he was the biggest hero they had ever seen, but other sources say he was rather ineffective, as well as inactive, in preventing the loss of life that the Titanic suffered. But Captain Smith was very experienced, who had served at sea for 40 years, 27 of those in command. This was the first real crisis that he was dealing with, and he was perfectly aware that even if they filled every single lifeboat to absolute capacity, it would not be enough to save everybody, leaving the rest to die in the frigid waters. It seems, like any human being, Smith may have become paralyzed in fear regarding what was about to happen, and knowing he really couldn't do anything about it. He ordered the passengers and crew to muster, but from that point onward, he failed to order his officers to put the passengers into the lifeboats. He didn't adequately organize his crew, and he failed to convey crucial information to his officers and crew. Sometimes he even gave ambiguous or impractical orders, and he never actually specifically said to abandon ship, although that was largely implied. Some of the bridge officers were actually unaware the ship was sinking for some time after they struck the iceberg. For example, 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall didn't find out until 1:15, which was barely an hour before the ship actually went under. Quartermaster George Rowe also had no idea what was happening. When the evacuation started, he actually phoned the bridge from his watch station to ask why he'd just seen a lifeboat go past. He really had no idea what was happening. Okay, Smith didn't inform his officers that the ship did not have enough lifeboats to save everyone. He didn't supervise the loading of the lifeboats, and seemingly made no effort to find out if his orders were being followed at all. It seems that, at least for a time, he may have resigned himself to the hopelessness of the situation, and almost kind of gave up, without even at least trying. But he did muster up some courage towards the end. Just minutes before the Titanic started sinking completely, Smith was making himself busy releasing the crew from their duties. He went to the Marconi operator's room and released Junior Marconi officer Harold Bride and Senior Wireless operator John Jack Phillips. He then carried out a final tour of the deck and told crew members, now it's every man for himself. At 2:10 a.m., Steward Edward Brown says he saw the captain approach with a megaphone in his hand. He heard him say, "Well, boys, do your best for the women and children, and look out for yourselves." He saw the captain walk onto the bridge alone. This was the last reliable sighting of Captain Smith. A few minutes later, trimmer Samuel Hemming found the bridge seemingly empty, and it's not known exactly where Smith was when the ship went down, though it is known that he was still on board. Some survivors claim they saw him enter the wheelhouse and die there when it was engulfed, and that's actually how it's portrayed in the well-known movie. There are also a few conflicting sources saying that Captain Smith was seen in the water near the overturned collapsible B, but this is largely believed to be incorrect. It would have been quite dark by this point, and it's not likely that the individual that people were seeing as the captain was actually Captain Smith, but either way, he went down with Titanic. Based on all this, you can probably tell that Captain Smith is a pretty controversial figure in the modern day. Some see him as a hero, others see him as somewhat inept and frightened during a time when the captain absolutely could not be that. It was not the time for his humanity and fear to take hold of him. He had to stand up and lead. But to an extent, he still did that, and in his defense, the actual sinking and the disaster that unfolded wasn't really his fault exactly. First of all, he wasn't in command when the ship hit the iceberg at all. The first officer was. And even if he had been, Titanic was doing exactly what every other ship on the Atlantic would have been doing at the time. On top of that, he certainly didn't design the vessel and was not responsible for the idea that they didn't need enough lifeboats for everybody because it wouldn't be necessary, when in fact it was necessary. But that wasn't his call. Granted, he did concur with a lot of silly ideas, like a ship not being able to sink in the modern day, but even many of the survivors didn't view him as a villain, or someone to blame for the disaster. Most had nothing of good things to say about him, and said that he died a hero. And perhaps that's the best way to remember him. There's a lot of other stories about the Titanic I could talk about now, and there were plenty of heroes of the Titanic, so if you want to see a video just focusing on that, I absolutely will, as there are many actual accounts of people genuinely doing acts of heroism that saved lives on that day. But as for the captain himself, well, the disaster caused a rethinking of how ships were built, as well as general practices when it came to ocean liners. And due to the notoriety, Captain Edward Smith, while he didn't invent it, popularized the idea that the captain goes down with their ship. This is something that's generally assumed by people in the sense of we expect them to die, but what we do expect is that they're the last ones off. It's their ship, they're in charge of her, and they're in charge of all the occupants. The captain knew that they couldn't save anyone, and as a result, he couldn't survive, because he had to be the last one off. And when so many other people would have no other option but to go down with Titanic, Captain Edward Smith made sure that they didn't do that alone. He remained with his ship till the end. So while it is possible to sit here and critique him and say that he could have done better, well, for one thing, he could have done a lot worse, and his final act was one of nobility and honor to the command that he so represented. And if you ask me, I think that's what he should be remembered for, if nothing else. And with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Ratio 78, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Crack, and Crystal Morgan, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, and Royal Hudson 2860. Till next time, this is Darkness, Individual Fond, farewell.